Taking it from the top, I think I'm northernmost. I'm Paul in Bellingham.
Okay, I'll try Earl and Everett.
You're introducing yourself, so you want to get your face up there so they can see you.
Oh. Kevin from Mount Vernon.
Mindy from Edmonds.
Jennifer from Spokane.
This is Tanner from Mount Vernon.
Arlene from Cedar Woolley.
Ren Autry from Vancouver.
Lisa Stridinger from Centralia.
Jones from Federal Way.
Woo!
Oh.
Oh, introduce yourself already.
Sharon's its office with Housing Alliance folks. So this is Michelle.
Oh,
Nick's here, and so is Divya. And I see we have a chat message from Patrick from Chehalis. Hi, Patrick.
That little hole up there. Yeah, this is the camera.
I can see the top screen.
Yeah, this is us.
The top screen. Oh no.
So during the training, when Michelle begins her program, I'm going to put everybody on mute just to control the sound. And then when it's time for questions or people have questions, just raise your hand or use the chat feature. And for folks on the phone, when Michelle's done talking, you'll also have a chance for questions as well. But just because there's so many of us on, that'll make sure everybody can hear. So that's how we're going to do it. And again, whenever you're ready, Michelle, take it away.
Okay. Can folks hear me?
Is yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just interrupt at any time if you can't. So I'm Michelle. I think many of you know me. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here with the Housing Alliance. And today we're going to be doing a training on interim advocacy. Today's agenda, we'll have a brief overview of the successful legislative session that experience with lawmakers. And then we'll go into the Housing Trust Fund, because that's the big ask we have. We're going to ask you to bring to your lawmakers is to invest deeply in the Housing Trust Fund to build more affordable homes. So we're going to try to accomplish all of that in this quick hour. And we have several times during the presentation that we're going to pause for questions and conversation. So our goal today is to make sure that you will learn how to set up a meeting, how to research your lawmaker, and how to have a successful meeting, and how to talk about the Housing Trust Fund. So that's our goals for today. So quickly, I think all of you know that we just had probably the most successful legislative session in our history. And that's because of the incredible advocacy of many of you and many of the advocates around the state. The screen you see before you just shows all the accomplishments we together were able to get past the session. of you came down and wore hard hats and advocated to get that passed as soon as possible. It had $107 million for the Housing Trust Fund. That's not enough. In the context of that capital budget, there were a lot of constraints on it, a lot of demands. So $107 actually was a lot of money. If you looked at all the other needs, especially school construction that the state was legally obligated to invest in because of a lawsuit, $107 million was a good accomplishment, but it's not nearly enough. And so we'll talk later about the ask for next year. House Bill 1570 was the document recording fee bill. This is going to bring in an additional $54 million every 2 years to directly invest in homelessness prevention and services. It also got rid of the sunset, so those fees are permanent. We're no longer going to need to worry about the state losing a significant share of our homelessness dollars. House Bill 2578 is the source of income discrimination bill. And both on House Bill 1570 and House Bill 2578, we're going to be doing a Learn at Lunch webinar next Wednesday, the 27th at 12 o'clock. And we're going to dive deeply into both of those bills with Mindy Woods, who advocated for both of those for many, many years with the Housing Alliance and through RAP. House Bill 2667 was the incredible bill that finally makes it so people with permanent disabilities no longer are going to lose their homes when the state determines them to have a permanent disability. It was otherwise, people, when their disability status was changing from temporary to permanent, they were losing their housing and essential needs rental assistance and only getting $197 in cash assistance. Nobody anywhere can pay the rent with $197. So this allows people to stay on HEN and still get that ABD cash assistance. And House Bill 2444 was a bill that fixes the way taxes are assessed on affordable homes. 2382 will make it so local governments and state government can donate and surplus public lands and properties for affordable homes. Land is typically the most expensive component to building affordable housing, so this will make our public dollars through the trust fund go so much further. Also, finding the land and siting it and competitively purchasing it's a huge problem, so this will help us build a lot more affordable housing. And then House Bill 1239 and 1831 have significant changes to the way our public assistance programs work. 1239 allows people to get a free copy of their medical records, their own medical records, once every 2 years if they're trying to apply for Social Security benefits and have been denied. And then 1831 just updates the asset limits, so the amount of assets one can have in order to still qualify for HEN, ABD, TANF, and other public assistance programs that hadn't been updated for so long, and people were literally being forced to choose between like selling their car and getting TANF. Totally unfair and backwards. The only bill that didn't pass was House Bill 2437, and that was a disappointment. It made it very far, made it to the Senate floor over from the House, and we have been talking to a lot of lawmakers since the session ended, and we have confidence or hope that with continued advocacy that bill can be passed next session. So this was just one of the ads that ran in the newspaper in the first week of session telling lawmakers to pass the capital budget. So why were these victories possible? It's because of persistent advocacy over the years. Voices across the state demanded action. Lawmakers heard from local advocates throughout the year. So during we're going to talk about the interim. So during the interim and during the legislative session, advocates together delivered a consistent and strategic message, and housing champions have been elected to state offices. In fact, 2 Housing Alliance board members are now lawmakers, Representative June Robinson and Representative Nicole Macri. And we have a third board member running for state office right now, Sophia Aragon, in the 34th Legislative District. So we elect housing champions. So why were these victories possible? In addition, we had record advocacy during the session. Well over 2,000 people sent emails to their lawmakers. 5,481 lawmakers received emails from advocates specifically about affordable housing and homelessness. And on our annual Homelessness and Housing Advocacy Day, 630 people came to lobby their lawmakers, which is incredible. It's the biggest advocacy day in Olympia every year. So I'm going to quickly just pause there and see if anybody has any questions before we move on. And it looks like there's one chat. What do I?
And I think you all are muted, so if you have questions, please type them into the chat box so we can read them and answer them.
Everybody's unmuted.
Okay, it sounds like nobody has questions, so that's fine. Let's keep moving on. All right. So advocating during sessions critical, and this is a picture of advocates at one of our homeless and housing advocacy days. They're standing on the Capitol steps in Olympia. But the interim provides really special opportunities. So that's what we're talking about today. So what is the interim? The interim is the intervening time between legislative sessions. So the legislature, by our state constitution, is convened during specific periods. And when the session ends, it's a formal process to end the session. And then that is called the interim. So it's the time in between the formal sessions. It's the time when lawmakers are at home, back in their district. Sometimes, oftentimes, because being a state lawmaker is not a full-time job, the lawmaker goes back to work. But although they're not paid full-time and year-round, they are lawmakers year-round and are accessible year-round and accept meetings year-round. So interim advocacy is just leveraging the opportunity during that interim period to educate lawmakers in your own district and in their own district. And why is this important? It's because during the interim, lawmakers have a lot more time. During the legislative session, it's really important to meet with lawmakers because the asks become very specific and they become, they're in reaction to what's happening. But when you're at home and your lawmakers are at home, you get so much more time. During the legislative session, at the most, you get 15 minutes. Oftentimes it's 10. When you testify before a committee, the most you'll get is 3 minutes, and you often get 2 minutes, and oftentimes even as little as 1 minute to get your point out. And so educating the lawmakers before they get to Olympia is really, really critical. And you have oftentimes up to an hour with lawmakers when you get a meeting during the interim. Minimally, you can expect a 30-minute meeting. So that's double the time you would otherwise have with them if you're only talking to them in Olympia during the session. So actually, one more thing about that. I think the other thing I would say about in-district advocacy is you can make the asks you have for your lawmaker very personal, and you can really drive home the impact, for example, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of affordable homes has on the people and yourself in their district, right? There's something really special about sitting somewhere that's close to home and talking about the issues that are impacting your community and that lawmaker's constituents. So how do you then go about setting up a meeting with your lawmaker? It's actually really easy. It sounds very intimidating, and to be quite honest, when I started this job, I was intimidated by it, and I've learned that everybody does it, and there's no wrong well, there might be a wrong way to do it, but there's no particularly right way to do it. I think the only wrong way to do it is to be like rude or not follow up with the lawmaker. But there's no particular right way you have to do it. I think the key is just being really polite, honestly, because it's your first sort of interaction with the lawmaker, and the lawmaker is trying to assess, like, oh, what would I expect from this person if I accepted this meeting? So you want to be very transparent about why you're requesting a meeting and what the lawmaker is going to expect to talk about with you. So first, in order to get the meetings scheduled, you can either call your lawmaker over the phone or you can email your lawmaker. And there's that's your choice. Both totally work. If you choose to email your lawmaker, and we're going to get to how you we're going to get a few minutes how you can get your lawmaker's address, email address. But if you choose to email them, I recommend just putting meeting request please in the subject line, or something like that. You can even say something like constituent meeting request, somebody in your district wants to meet with you, but make it really clear in the subject line that you're requesting a meeting with the lawmaker. So all lawmakers have their legislative assistant, who we always shorten that to LA. So every time you hear me saying LA or somebody else saying LA, we're not talking about the city or the county. We're talking about the legislative assistant. So the legislative assistant is their scheduler. In the Senate, they have more staff. So sometimes if you're meeting with a senator, they'll have somebody who's not their legislative assistant scheduling the meeting, but it doesn't matter for your purposes. You'll be just talking to somebody who's in their office. What's important though is anytime you talk to somebody from your lawmaker's office, whether it be a scheduler, an intern, or an LA, remember that these people are powerful gatekeepers, especially if it's the LA. Some LAs in Olympia have been with their lawmakers for a really, really long time and have a lot of sway over their lawmakers' decisions. And so when you approach the legislative assistant, either by phone or by email, the key is to consider them kind of like a lawmaker too. You're lobbying them. You're developing a relationship with them, just like you want to develop a relationship with the lawmaker.
About talking to lawmakers.
As an aside, I will say that one of the things that I think has made the Housing Alliance so successful is that we have always developed deep relationships with the legislative assistants, and they are extraordinarily incredible sources of information and access. And so that has been really, really key in our success over the years. And so we just highly recommend that you treat them like a lawmaker as well. So actually, let me go back to a couple more things. The things that the LA will ask you, and so be prepared to answer when you're scheduling the meeting, is who else will be coming with you? It's okay if you're not going to bring anybody else. That's absolutely fine. But if you are bringing anybody else, or if you hope that other people will come with you, just be very transparent about that. If you're not quite sure if like a couple of folks can come or not, but you are inviting them, just tell them that and say, well, it's minimally going to be just me, but I'm also hoping a couple of your other constituents will come if we can find a date that works for them. And then typically you can just firm that up before the actual meeting. If it's a really big group though, if for some reason you want to bring like more than 5 people, you really need to let the lawmaker know that, because oftentimes, especially during the interim, they need to find a special space to hold the meeting, because the in-district offices of the lawmakers are actually pretty small, and so they may have to go find some place separate to meet. Okay, so they're going to ask you who's meeting with you and how many people. They're going to ask you what topics you want to discuss, what you want to talk about. If you need anything special, like an accessible location, like wheelchair accessible, please be clear about that with them too, because sometimes the district offices aren't accessible, but they can oftentimes meet like at a local coffee shop that is accessible in their district. And so just work that out with them. And they're gonna also want your day of contact phone number. So if you have a mobile phone, a cell phone, it's gonna be important to share that with the lawmaker, because if anything comes up, they can call you. Oftentimes they'll want to confirm that the meeting is still on, especially if you've scheduled like several weeks out. So they may call you the day before, or honestly too, oftentimes if the lawmaker's running late, either the lawmaker or their legislative assistant will contact you and just let you know like, hey, so-and-so is running 5 minutes late, please hold on, is that okay? And that's obviously really helpful to know. All right, so that's the logistics of how to do it. Now, how do you set yourself up to be successful in that meeting? The first thing to do is to make sure you know your lawmaker and you research them. So one, all the slides we're going to talk about now is how to do this on your own, but you should really know that the Housing Alliance is a resource for this. You can call me directly if you're meeting with any lawmaker and ask me what I know about this person and things that you should be prepared for. We also, on our website right now, have the track record, the voting record of every current lawmaker from the last legislative session. So you can go to our website, I think you all have it, waliha.org, and look up the voting track record from 2018, to see where your lawmaker stood on our issues. In addition to that, though, there's other resources we're going to talk about to research your lawmaker. The things you're going to want to try to figure out is, you know, what is the lawmaker's position generally on affordable housing and homelessness? And then, like I said, you can get specific to look at their voting track record on our lead issues. You also want to know, though, does the lawmaker serve on any key policy committees or budget committees? Do they hold leadership within their caucus? And a caucus, you probably know what that means, but just in case, a caucus is a space where people meet and organize themselves by their political party. So there's a House Democratic caucus and a Senate Democratic caucus, and there's a House Republican caucus and a Senate Republican caucus. So that's what I mean by caucus. So each caucus has leadership. There's the person at the top. In the House, it's called the Speaker. In the Senate, it's called the Senate Majority Leader, and that's a special title that's only for the party that's in power, so the party who has the most people. If you are, in this case, like the way our political climate is right now in Washington State, the Republicans have one less lawmaker in each chamber, so they're not in power. And so their leadership titles are just a little bit different, but they still have somebody who organizes the entire caucus and is the decision maker. And then they have a lot of other roles that are considered leadership. And so you can find out all this by researching them, by either talking to the Housing Alliance or finding this information on the legislative website. And we're going to get to that website in just a second. Obviously, the other things you want to know, like we've already talked about, is their voting record. And then what other policy issues the lawmaker has a history of supporting and opposing. And you can find that out from the website as well. So we're going to get to that in one quick second. Before we get to the website, though, I just want to also note that social media is an incredible resource to get to know your lawmaker. It is a wealth of information. Almost all lawmakers, not everyone, but almost all lawmakers have a social media page on our profile on Facebook. And most of them, many of them, will accept all friend requests. And some of them just make their pages public. And so if you're on Facebook, it's a really good idea to look at the lawmaker's Facebook page. Be careful, though, and think thoughtfully if you want to be friends with them, and whether or not you want to allow them to see your Facebook page as well. And if you do that, remember you did it, and remember then not to say bad things about your lawmaker on your Facebook page, because they will see it. Unless, of course, you want them to see it. That's a choice you'll have to make, but just don't do that by accident. Know what you're getting into. You know, there's other social media platforms like Twitter that a lot of lawmakers are on, and that can be very informative as well. The other thing to look up, though, is their campaign page. For right now, for example, in Washington State, every single state representative is up for re-election. The entire House of Representatives is up, every single one of them. So every single one of them has a campaign page. And every single one of them on their campaign page will say what they care about. And they will try to represent themselves as, you know, how they want their constituents and voters to see them. The other things you can see, though, on that campaign page is which people and organizations have endorsed them. So, for example, I work a lot on tenant protections, right? That's a big issue area for the Housing Alliance. If I see on anybody's campaign page, whether they're a new candidate or an incumbent, so somebody who's already elected, if I see that the Rental Housing Association, who is the main landlord lobby group who opposes all of our efforts in Olympia, if I see that they have endorsed this candidate, that tells me something very important about that lawmaker. That means that they answered a questionnaire for that organization in a way that made that organization feel like that lawmaker is going to represent their interests in Olympia. So that's important to know. So there's things like that you can find out on the campaign page. You can also oftentimes see awards and stuff like that. Okay, but the state legislature actually has one of the best legislative websites in the country. It's actually won awards for both how much information it has on there and how accessible it is. That said, it does have a lot of information, so it's not super duper easy to navigate. I recommend, if you've never gone to this website, to go to it today or soon and just poke around and see what you can learn. There's a wealth of information. For our purposes today, I'm just going to focus on information on specific lawmakers. So this is a screenshot of actually what you would find if you clicked on this this page. So this is ledge.wa.gov is the state's website, but you can get to this roster of members with this URL. And so I recommend you actually write this down because it's kind of buried in the website otherwise, and it's really, really useful because it's this page where you can see all of the legislative assistants' names, and it's the only page that has that. Even if you go to the lawmakers' homepage through the state legislature's website, they actually don't give you the LA's name or contact information. So it's this roster of member page that's particularly important for that. And it allows you, this is a screenshot, so I can't click on it and show you, but if you clicked on the lawmaker's name, what you would get is this. And so you get a quick summary of who the lawmaker is, what legislative districts they're in, their contact information, both in their Olympia office and their home office, and then you get to see what committees they're on. So this is Senator Andy Billig from the 3rd Legislative District. We can see he's on early learning in K-12, on the Education Committee, on the Rules Committee, and on the Ways and Means Committee. If we clicked on his homepage, we could see other things about him, like if he's in leadership, it'll say, and it'll have a lot of more information about him, including his biography. If you just clicked on this details down here, these where you can see the email and details, if you clicked on details, that gives you the opportunity to, what will pull up is a voting record. And you click on that, and then you can choose what you want to see. And it gives you the option to see what bills the lawmaker prime sponsored, meaning what are the ones that they were the first name on, meaning that they were the big champion of. And that's really important. Remember, we said a few minutes ago that finding out what other issues your lawmaker really focuses on and champions is really, really key to getting to know them. And so if you click on those details and see what bills the lawmaker introduced, you're going to learn a lot about them. So, you know, we might learn, because he's on, this lawmaker right here is on a bunch of education committees. It would be interesting. I mean, we could assume that, I don't know, but we could assume that maybe he sponsored a bunch of bills around education. Is it K through 12 education? Is it public education? Does it have to do with charter schools? Does it have to do with universities and higher education? Like, what's the issue area that speaks to him? And then what does that say to you? Or what does it mean? Can we correlate that into his, you know, understanding or compassion for or affinity towards affordable housing and homelessness issues? And then you can actually see which bills they've also co-sponsored. So they're not the prime, but they put their name on it. So they care about the bill and they want to be associated with it. And then, of course, on our webpage, you can get their voting record through a variety of ways, but you can't get it summarized by issue area. So it's our webpage, waliha.org, where we've made it simple for you by making a grid to show you how lawmakers voted on affordable housing and homelessness issues. So you need to use both resources, really. All right, so that's how to research your lawmaker and how to make the meeting. Now we're going to talk about how to have a successful meeting. The key to having a successful meeting is just knowing what you want to accomplish. I mean, it's pretty simple. You just need to do this work beforehand, and especially if you're bringing multiple people with you. So if you're bringing, you know, a group or even just one other person, you want to have this conversation before the meeting. So you both, or all of you, share what you want to get out of the meeting. Because even if you have a half hour, or even if you have an entire hour, you gotta you've got to really pay attention to the flow of the meeting, and you've got to be sometimes very persistent about getting the information out during the meeting. Some lawmakers are talkers, and they might want to take up the entire meeting, just like, what's that phrase, like shooting the breeze or whatever, whatever the phrase is. They just, like, a lot of lawmakers are just like, hey, how you doing? What do you think about this development? I love this coffee shop. Yeah, because, oh my God, this funny thing happened with my kid the other day. I mean, they just, I don't know, they're bored, or they're tired of talking about policy, or they don't want to be held accountable. They don't want you to ask the hard questions, so they're going to take up all the space, like rambling about something else. So you have to be really, like, clear about what you want to accomplish, and then sometimes you have to be really directive and say, oh, that's nice. That was a nice story about your kid. Can we talk about homelessness right now? Or I wanted to tell you about this thing. You know, you have to just be very clear about what you want to accomplish and make sure that's shared with your other people that are coming with you. So all meetings provide you with the opportunity to develop a relationship, and that's, you should always approach the meeting of like, I want to continue this relationship. Even if you find the lawmaker oppositional to our issues, even if you know that the lawmaker is known to not be supportive, the goal should be to develop a relationship so that eventually, hopefully, you can influence the lawmaker and you can persuade them to vote the way you want them to vote on our issues. You can use the meeting to introduce an issue that's new to a lawmaker, or to reframe an issue and to educate them. Maybe we've seen them, you know, not be great on something, and you want to say, I know you had questions about this issue, or you said that everybody who lives in affordable homes should work, because otherwise we're, you know, whatever negative stereotypes they may have said or issue, you know, sometimes you meet with them specifically to address that in a polite way, but in a direct way. So you're educating the lawmaker. And the one thing you should always do, regardless, is make a very specific request. And so we're going to talk later about a specific request that you can bring this interim to your lawmaker about the Housing Trust Fund. But you should always ask your lawmaker to do something. So I'm going to pause there for a quick second and see if anybody has any questions. Is there anything in the chat?
Some people on.
I think it's going to mute again.
Yeah, everyone unmute. Muting.
Yeah, I didn't understand that last question.
I'm going to take it off and mute again.
Okay, well, Divya's going to monitor the chat, so if you do have questions, at me. Okay. And obviously, you know where to find me, so it's not like after this webinar, you're not going to be able to talk to me. So, all right, so let's go on to communication pitfalls to avoid. And in introducing this next section, I want to say why we're doing this and why we're focusing on this part as well. You know, I've been at the Housing Alliance for almost 10 years now, and I've worked with a wide variety of advocates, helping them try to have successful meetings. And I've had a lot of lawmaker meetings myself, and I've learned a lot of things from those meetings. There's some really common things that come up every year that can make your meeting less successful. And common in that it happens frequently, everybody does it, and it's not a reflection of like somebody being like a bad advocate or something. It's just, we've learned a lot of lessons, and we want to share those with you so that when you have your meeting, you can be as successful as possible. So it's sort of taking these years of learning from many people across the state and from my own experiences, and helping you sort of have a step up and walk into the meeting with all these years of experience behind you. So first, we want to talk about communication pitfalls to avoid. So we really, I guess, request and recommend that you, in your meetings with lawmakers, try really hard to avoid using language that labels anybody else, either another person or a group, or that reinforces negative stereotypes about people, or that equates to somebody's circumstance with their identity. Oh, okay. All right, so we'll keep going. So like I was saying, something that equates somebody's circumstances, avoid doing something that equates somebody's circumstance with their primary identity. So some of the language that we see being used out there that we think is not helpful are things like the homeless, homeless people. You may have also heard this really weird thing that happens where people talk about homeless as if, so they're replacing the term like a person experiencing homelessness with just homeless. And it's this really weird way that it's showing up in the English language that is really demeaning and odd, but it's consistently happening. And you'll hear it like if you like hear a commentator on the radio, or if they're asking somebody, you'll even hear it from service providers, honestly. And so it's just something that is super demeaning and reduces somebody completely to their circumstances as experiencing homelessness. The homeless service world providers also tend to use words that are really kind of alienating and dehumanizing. Like and it's interesting because all these terms, like so many that we use in our language, have come because they were trying to do something better than what they were currently doing. So there was this trend to call people who are using homeless services clients. And they thought that that was better because whatever they were using previous to that was turning out to be dehumanizing. And then there's also this trend to call people consumers or beneficiaries or program user. And what we have found is that just all of those things are kind of dehumanizing. And so instead of using languages like that, we recommend to try instead, like instead of saying homeless in place of a homeless person or somebody experiencing homelessness, or instead of saying the homeless, we recommend just saying a person experiencing homelessness, right? It puts the humanity in, it says they're a person and a person first, and then they're experiencing something rather than being defined by it. And you probably wouldn't be in the position of necessarily speaking from a service provider position, but if you were talking about people who like a tenant with Section 8, instead of calling them clients, consumers, beneficiaries, there's other ways to talk about people that are much more specific, like a Section 8 tenant. Like that's specific. They're not a client, they're not a consumer, they're a Section 8 tenant. They're a person, they're a human being who is using a Section 8 voucher. But as you know, as RAP leaders and members, I also think I don't have all the answers. And so you can see on the screen there, I asked the question, what do you think is better, a better way to refer to people who are utilizing services or receiving services? Let's see if the chat would work for you guys to share some thoughts on this, since the sound is so bad. Does anybody have any ideas on things that would be better ways to refer to folks rather than client, consumer, beneficiary?
Them a lot of times. This is Lisa from Centralia. A lot of times what I do is I refer to them as my friends without homes when I'm speaking specifically about the individuals themselves. I refer to them personally as my friends without homes.
That's awesome. That's beautiful. I think that's really good. And you can talk about them being your neighbors, right? My neighbors without homes. If you don't feel like you know them, if they're not really your friends, or my community members, my fellow community members.
I'll say community members.
So I'm seeing on the chat, we have Patrick saying neighbors without homes, getting to what Michelle and Lisa were saying. Katie S says constituents and the people that we work with, or participants in our program. We have someone saying people I contact.
This is Paul in Bellingham. Let me know when I can get a word in.
Go ahead, Paul.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, what we use up here with regard to Section 8, that's got a real stigma to it. So HUD's changed it to housing choice vouchers. We say our friends who would like to have a choice in housing or have a housing choice voucher, just to get rid of that stigma of Section 8.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, absolutely.
We have one more chat from Angela C. saying, referring to people experiencing homelessness as guests, which is something high-end restaurants use rather than clients or customers.
Yeah, good point. Do we get to keep the chat? Cool. Okay, this is all really, really good input. Thank you, everybody. So let's keep going with this conversation, and keep weighing in via chat too, please. So other phrases, so this isn't like adjectives, this is more like phrases that are cropping up consistently. The homeless problem, I'm sure you've all heard that. Or descriptions of homelessness as an intractable problem that's never going to be solved and it's always going to be part of our society. And then phrases that that imply that the solutions are expensive or out of reach. You know, all imply that both the solutions that we're advocating for are not appropriate or can't work, or it just like implies a sense of homelessness or helplessness around homelessness that is demotivating for, I think, both the general public and for lawmakers. So, you know, in place of the homelessness problem, you know, we often talk about the homelessness crisis. Instead of talking about, you know, just using descriptors that imply that homelessness is never going to be solved, we say that it is preventable and solvable. And I think that those are just really important things to keep in mind. And as you know, do your meetings with lawmakers this interim, we would love to hear how they're going and any lessons you learned. And if you know, have this up, if something comes to you like, oh, I had this great way that I answered this question, or this epiphany on how to flip this public narrative, let us know. You know, we want to learn from your experiences as well. So let's move on to answering hard questions. Hard questions inevitably are going to come up during your meetings, and so it's just really wise to be prepared for them. One trick to addressing a hard question is to flip it on the questioner. So if a lawmaker says something to you like, why are so many homeless people lazy or not working, like just something really negative, just flip it and be like, let me tell you about my story, or let me tell you about all the people I know who are working, or let me tell you how hard it is, how much work it is to be somebody who's experiencing homelessness. Like, just completely reframe their question to a positive or to what you want to answer and flip it on them. And you can really sound like, if you do that, that you're answering their question, or that you're, because it requires really active listening, then you get to push the conversation towards an area that is much more productive, right? Instead of putting you on the defense. You can, you know, talk about positive things instead of really negative, addressing really negative stereotypes. One really key thing though too is if a lawmaker ever asks you a question that you either feel uncomfortable answering or you don't know the answer to, don't ever feel like you have to answer a question that you don't know the answer to or don't want to answer. You can flip it if you don't want to answer it, or you can also say something like, you know, I don't have those statistics in front of me. I don't know the dollar amount that was in the budget last year for this program, but I can find out and I'm going to get back to you. And the reason why this is really powerful is, well, one, you just don't want to tell Lawmaker wrong information because you're developing relationship and you want them to continue, to rely on you and to ask you questions. But two, it's actually a hook to continue to develop the relationship and the conversation. So I actually really love it when lawmakers have questions that I can't answer. And actually, Nick and I were talking about this yesterday, and Nick said he used to, in his meetings with lawmakers, actually pretend like he didn't know the answer sometimes, just so he could have this hook to follow up on with the lawmaker, to continue the conversation. That's how useful it is. So don't ever feel intimidated if you get a question that you feel like you can't answer, because it's actually really helpful. Just one recommendation: make sure you write down the question. Yeah, and Nick's laughing, and he's saying, and make sure you do follow up, because that's obviously they're relying on you, and you want to follow through. Quickly to things not to do, and I put this in the context of this conversation around answering hard questions, because oftentimes lawmakers will say, fine, you want that program funded? What do you want me to cut instead? I mean, it literally is a common question. And we highly recommend that you never, ever take that bait. You never, ever offer up another program to cut or eliminate, for many, many reasons, but mostly because you could be offering up the pet project of that lawmaker to cut, right? Or something that maybe one of their constituents just met with them about. So it's an impossible choice, and lawmakers are elected to make those kinds of choices, and the budget writers and negotiators are the ones who ultimately make that decision, and it's advocacy that's going to drive that. It's not one idea that comes out of any one meeting. So never take that bait, and never offer up a program to cut or eliminate. And you should also expect the question or statement that because homelessness is growing across the state, the resources that we're already investing must not be working. And that's just obviously not true. So I'm going to speed ahead a little bit, actually, because we're a little bit late. We're running a little bit behind. And so answering the hard questions on the increase in homelessness. We know, you know, that the main driver of homelessness in our state, and especially probably in the country, but particularly on the whole west coast of the United States, is our sky-high rent increases. There's a direct correlation between an inability to pay the rent and homelessness. And so it's really important to focus on something that seems so simple and obvious. People are looking for complicated answers to pretty simple, to things where there's a simple solution, right? Rent increases cause homelessness, and that's an important message to drive home to your lawmaker. Homelessness is increasing because this state has chosen to not regulate rents. Rents are out of control, people can't pay their rent, and there's a direct correlation between that and homelessness. The lawmaker may also ask for questions about, like, well, what's the role of personal responsibility? They may allege that homelessness is increasing solely because of the opioid crisis, and because people have drug addictions. When we get those questions, we're like, yeah, of course, if you have a drug addiction, you're less likely to be able to pay the rent. And that's a contributor, but it's not a main cause, and it does not account for the increase in homelessness. The increases in homelessness that we're seeing is directly correlated to rent increases. So there are studies that prove this, and sometimes lawmakers want studies to prove things. They don't just want personal experiences. We find that most lawmakers want both. They want facts and figures that they can, if they don't need convincing, that they can use to convince their colleagues. And they also want to hear what's happening to their constituents, and they're very motivated by personal stories. But if they need facts and figures, there are them. They exist, and that's what's in front of you. There's a Journal of Urban Affairs study, which is a prominent, widely respected journal, that shows that for every $100 increase in rent, there's at least a 6% increase in homelessness in urban areas, and a 32% increase in homelessness in non-metro areas. Obviously, too, rents are out of reach. The new National Low-Income Housing Coalition Out of Reach report just came out, and it's showing that a minimum wage worker in Washington State has to work at least 75 hours in order to afford a modest one-bedroom apartment in Washington State. And that's impossible, 75 hours a week. And so you can use these facts and figures, and we can provide these to you before your meeting. So we don't need to go into all the details, because we want to get to the Housing Trust Fund too. But we have more data here for you that you can use and that we can talk about while you're preparing for your meetings. These are graphs put together by the Department of Commerce. This one right here shows that the investments in homelessness are working. We're just not keeping up with the need. You can see on here that in 2006, when we first created the state's document recording fees, that is the main way we fund homelessness, they got enacted in law. It took about a year or two for them to accumulate, and we saw a massive drop in homelessness once we started investing homelessness resources. Then the recession hit, and rent started rising, and people's incomes started to deeply lag behind the increases in rent. And so we saw homelessness increasing, and we still are seeing it increase this day, but it's not nearly as high even as it was back in 2006. This is a really cool chart made by the Department of Commerce that just shows the big gap between wages, especially amongst people earning the lowest wages in our state, and the median rents in our state. It's a nice one to use with lawmakers. We can give that to you to share with them. And this just shows how, rents are growing. We all know that rents are sky high across the state. So let's hold questions until we quickly talk about the Housing Trust Fund, because we're running low on time. So we wanted to give you a really tangible ask for your lawmakers and your meetings. We're still developing our 2019 legislative agenda, so we don't have all the details yet. There's going to be opportunities for all of you to weigh in, to give us input, if you haven't already, on what you think our legislative agenda should be. But one of the things we know we will be asking for is more money invested into affordable homes through the Housing Trust Fund. We don't know the exact dollar amount, but we know we're going to at least be asking for $200 million in the State Housing Trust Fund. That's funded out of the capital budget. And next year, 2019, is the beginning of a new biennium, so there's going to be a brand new budget created and a brand new budget written. And so we'll be asking for, out of that capital budget, at least $200 million. If you're lawmakers on one of the budget committees, then they're going to be a particularly powerful lawmaker to bring this ask to. And so this is just more details on the Housing Trust Fund and the legislative ask. And this is some talking points around how to talk about the trust fund. I'm not going to read them out loud right now because we are running low on time. I don't want to leave time for questions and answers, but we'll provide this. We'll email out this webinar to everybody. The PowerPoint to everybody so you can have it in front of you. One really cool thing about the trust fund, in my opinion, is, and one thing to share with lawmakers, is that the overwhelming bulk of the dollars have been invested into homes for people who have the lowest incomes in our state. So over 70% of the funds have been invested in homes that provide provide homes for people who are considered extremely low income. And that means people earning 30% or less of the area median income in our state. And if you have questions about any of these terms, we can, like AMI and stuff, we can totally talk about those. We have some stuff we can send you to. And this just shows that the Housing Trust Fund has been invested in every community in our state and has built homes in every community in our state. For those of you who live in affordable homes funded by the State Housing Trust Fund, you have a particularly important story to share. Your story is really, really critical to showing lawmakers how powerful and important and life-changing it is when we build homes that people can afford. So with that, I want to see if there's any last questions that folks have. We can either unmute it or look at the chat. Let's look at the chat first. Okay, so nobody's put any questions in the chat.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, it's on the other side.
Go ahead.
Right? Yeah. It's that right here.
Do any of you have questions, or is that just background noise? Okay. Sounds like that's not a question. Totally fine. So another plug for the webinar next Wednesday that you can all sign up for. Actually, we can send the link out, right? So Nick and Divya will send you the link to sign up for it. And again, we're going to go into detail on the source of income discrimination bill that just passed. and 1570, the document recording fee bill. That's helpful in case you get questions from lawmakers, but also particularly with the source of income discrimination bill, we want to make sure, especially if you use rental assistance, that you know what your rights are, and that you know the ins and outs of the law so you can help other people know what their rights are. And again, we're available if you have questions. And so if any of this webinar didn't make sense to you, or if you have more questions that occurred because of it, I am very accessible and happy to have more conversations with you, either one-on-one or through any of your next calls.
So I'm seeing one question from Angela C. Is this going to be recorded to go back to? And yes, Angela, it is. The webinar is being recorded right now, and we will send out the webinar and the slides to you at some point next week.
All right. Well, with that, Michael, do you have anything else do you want to wrap it up or anything?
No, you did a wonderful job. I'm just hosting the webinar. I do apologize for some of the sound malfunctions. With such a big group, I didn't mute and unmute as quick as I could have. So thank you for everyone's patience, and have a great day.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for taking the time for this, and thank you for making meetings with your lawmakers. It's going to make a big difference. Let us know how they go. We really want to hear about it. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
We gotta wait.